Well, good afternoon, everyone. I see that it is exactly 4 p.m. My name is Jean-Sébastien Rioux. I'm an associate professor and director of the International Policy and Trade Research Division at the School of Public Policy. It's my pleasure to host this virtual Policy in a Pint event from my dining room table in Calgary's inner city Northwest community of Mount Pleasant, where anything can and may happen because I have 3 young kids at home. But we're going to talk about the upcoming November election. Thank you all very much for joining us today. The School of Public Policy is Canada's leading policy school, known for our practical research and for bringing people together to discuss important issues with experts like what we're doing here today. I've seen the registration list, and many of you have joined us before for our Policy in Pint series, which allow for a frank discussion of serious topics in a more relaxed, neutral, and accessible setting. We usually hold these very fun events at a local downtown establishment, Junction YYC, who've always been very good to us. The event today was originally scheduled to be held there on March 24th, but since COVID-19 has changed the way we do things, we're trying for the first time to have a Policy in a Pint in Zoom. Whether or not you're actually holding a pint in your hands right now is entirely up to you, but I am. An excellent local brew, Citizen Brewery, about 10 blocks from here this was made. So feel free to set yourself up with a relaxing beverage. Now, it's my immense pleasure to welcome our guests who will help us dive deeply into current American politics and analyze the state of affairs leading up to the November elections. And joining us from his home headquarters in Calgary is Dr. Frank Towers, who's an associate professor of history at the University of Calgary, specializing in American politics. Although his academic research focuses mostly on the Civil War era, he teaches, gives talks, and appears in the media on current state of US politics. He has been voting in US elections since the 1980s and has volunteered on several US political campaigns since then. Welcome, Frank. And our special guest this afternoon, or evening for her, joining us from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, is Dr. Kelly Dittmar, who is an associate professor of political science at Rutgers University in New Jersey and director of research and scholar at the Center for American Women in Politics. She's the author and co-author of several books, including A Seat at the Table, Congresswomen's Perspectives on Why Their Representation Matters, published at Oxford University Press in 2018, and Navigating Gendered Terrain, Stereotypes and Strategy in Political Campaigns, published at Temple University Press. Dr. Dittmar was an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow from 2011 to 2012, where she served as a legislative aide on education, labor, social welfare, and women's issues. And before that, she worked as a federal legislative assistant for Governor Jennifer Granholm, the 47th governor and first woman to serve as governor of Michigan. Welcome, and one day, Kelly, we hope to welcome you to Calgary in person.
I look forward to it.
Great, and so do we. Now, moving right along to the main event, my intent for the next 40 minutes or so is for our panelists to begin with an overview of how they view the current US political landscape leading up to the election, followed by a vibrant discussion among the 3 of us before opening up the conversation to your questions. Now, here's a twist. With this move to a virtual Policy in a Pint, right after the Q&A, we'll invite guests who wish to continue the conversation to jump to a Zoom room for a more informal and interactive, moderated discussion. Hey, let's see if that works. Your test subjects for this new format. Now, the 3 of us have been in contact and we've deliberated on this. And so without further ado, we'll begin today's discussion with Dr. Towers. So please, Frank, over to you and tell us about how you see the upcoming US election.
Well, thank you, JS. It's good to be here. It's a shame, of course, that we are not doing this in person as we had planned back in March. And thanks to everybody who's there out in the audience. This is another episode of virtual discussion, and we'll see how it goes. We'd love to be there with you all in person. So we decided to split this up with giving me the presidential race to talk about, and Kelly's going to talk about the down ballot races. And that's mostly because Kelly is so much more knowledgeable about US politics. I could probably get my way through the presidential, but she's gonna know more about the down ballot. So I'll lead with that, but it's mostly based on ignorance. As I look at this, I mean, 2016 is on my mind, and I think one way to think about 2020 is What's changed since 2016? And in my take, a lot has changed and not very much has changed. So let's think about that. First of all, the a lot is easier to figure out. That is how much has changed. We're in the middle of a pandemic. It's also produced the greatest economic catastrophe since the Great Depression, with unemployment levels hovering around 20% and maybe going higher. Businesses closed. 100,000 Americans dead from the coronavirus in a short space of a few months. It is the world's leader in traced cases, and it's something that if anyone saw it coming, good for them, because very few of us did, despite warnings about pandemics. It really has caught people by surprise and changed everything about the way we live. We're going to have an election in the middle of that. We can see a little bit about how that might look from the primaries. Maybe we can talk about that going forward. But a general election, which might have the biggest electorate ever in American history, although we'll see how many people actually turn out to vote based on circumstances. Who knows what will happen? It'll be fascinating. Another thing has changed. Donald Trump, the politician with no political experience who ran in 2016, had never held elective office. His entire reputation was based on his career in business and television, is now the incumbent 4 years later, having served as president with a record to run on. He ran against the establishment. It's hard to find a more establishment figure than the sitting president of the United States. And that poses some real different dynamics for how voters are going to think about it. May not change the way he runs, but it's certainly a different situation than in 2016, when the Republican Party, Trump's party, was in charge of Congress and the Senate, but most voters associate government with the president. And if there was any running on the record to be done, it was on the record of the Democrats under Obama. Now, with 2 years with three-branch control under the House, Senate, and the presidency, and then the last year and three-quarters with the Democrats in charge of the House, but Trump in the Senate, it's the Republicans who have to run on the record. And it'll be a very different dynamic from there. Anyone who saw this coming in 2016 politically, again, I hope you were wagering heavily because you're very wealthy now and no one saw this happening. So how can I say not much has changed? I think there's a good case to say that there's eerie similarities between 2016 and 2020. First off, the candidates. Trump, running again. Joe Biden, the vice president of Barack Obama, like Hillary Clinton, a closely attached to Obama, part of the administration, someone who has a very long history in the Democratic Party. If you wanted to pick an establishment Democrat, Joe Biden would be hard to beat in that category. He is running as Clinton did, in part as a defender of Obama's legacy, probably even more so, having served as vice president. And to the extent that the election of 2016 was in some way a retrospective about the Obama years, the 2020 election for Biden will necessarily have that legacy be part of it. A few other things haven't changed. You know, we'll talk more, I think, about who's voting and what the voters are going to look like. But the coalitions that came together in 2016 look really similar in 2020. There's been some shifting, some important shifts, but the basic outlines of the Republican Party holding its base in the middle of the country, especially in the South, Mississippi Valley, the parts of the interior West, the Democrats doing well on the coast, Democrats doing better in cities, Republicans doing better in rural areas, suburbs as battlegrounds. All that stuff is familiar to people who've been watching US elections for the last couple of decades. Another thing that's eerily similar, Donald Trump's approval rating. For all the ups and downs and the incredible turbulence of American politics, we were just before we got on talking about the last weekend since we last met. A lot has happened, and that's a daily event in the U.S. Throughout all this stuff, Donald Trump's approval has hovered between about 40 to 45%. That is 40 to 45% is approve, and somewhere around 50 to 54, 55% disapprove. And even a pandemic hasn't changed that dynamic. So are we going to be in an election that's fundamentally different, or are we going to be in an election that is a rehash of the same issues in 2016? Election prognosticators think it's still going to come down to a few of the same battleground states, extra attention on Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, now Arizona, Florida's in the mix, but still that same handful of battleground states, because of the way the U.S. Electoral College works, will see a lot of ground covered again. I want to close this off by mentioning one interesting thing that's different, and it's a subtle thing, but it just caught my eye. This is the polling average in head-to-head matchups. So I went back and looked at 2016 to see how far ahead Hillary Clinton was, because my memory of that, I think everybody's was, she was way ahead, got narrow at the end, but she was still ahead. Trump pulled off this incredible upset. And the 2016 polling averages on Real Clear Politics, the site, they just aggregate the polls, other versions of it out there. Trump was actually ahead a few times. He was ahead late in 2015. And this is really interesting, on May 22nd, 2016, Trump was ahead. Trump had the polling average lead. Clinton had clawed back to a 1-point lead exactly 4 years ago today. And then she widened it out. Hillary got to about a 12-point lead at the maximum in the late spring. And Trump narrowed it again. He came back, was ahead briefly in the summer. It went up, it went down. Towards the end, it really narrowed. And Clinton went into election night with a polling average of about 3%, which actually was not far off the total popular vote. Compare that with the Biden-Trump race. That has not budged much at all. Biden has held something like a 5-point lead consistently since his name got put into the polling mix against Trump. His polling average today is 5 points. It's been as high as about 6 or 7. It's been as low as about 4. There's nowhere near that kind of movement up and down. And that may tell us the most about how this election is going to look. Well, I'll close it there and turn it over to Kelly.
Thanks a lot.
Great.
Kelly.
Sure. So obviously, a lot of the story for this election will be at the top of the ballot. Most of the news, most of the attention will be what's happening at the presidential level. But in addition to the top of the ticket, we have the entire U.S. House of Representatives, 435 seats, 2/3 of our U.S. Senate, and most state legislative seats across the country that will be up for election this year. And so there's a few things, again, to watch for at that level, some tied to the presidential race, of course. The biggest narrative is going to be about party control. So because of the dominance of our two-party system and the increasing polarization, which I think we'll talk a little bit more about between parties and partisans in the U.S., the next election, this fall's election, will help to shape which party holds the power, the most power at the state and federal levels, and then also tied to that, which party is shaping the agendas at these levels. So at the congressional level, we'll be watching, I think, two trends, or two sort of questions are outstanding. One, will the Democrats maintain control of the U.S. House of Representatives? As you know from the news and Speaker Pelosi, that's really been the fail-safe against this president. So when Democrats are trying to hold the line, they have votes in the U.S. House to stem some of the movement of Republicans. The other question is if the Republican Party will maintain control of the U.S. Senate, so our upper chamber. And both of these, if you look at, again, the prognostications from Cook Political Report or others, you see that there are enough toss-up races and enough competitive races, at least at this point in the election, that you could see either chamber going either way. And so there's a lot, as we know, in general in this moment, a lot of uncertainty, but that uncertainty also bleeds into what we might see at the congressional level. And of course, depending on which parties hold or not the Congress, that will also matter in terms of who wins the presidency to see if we have unified party control or divided party control going forward and really change the agenda and what can get done. I would say at this point, it is not entirely likely that we'll see the Democrats take over the Senate or the Republicans take over the House, but it's certainly not impossible. So we'll be watching some of the most vulnerable races, many of which are the races that were flipped from Republican to Democrat in the 2018 election. At the state legislative level, the top of the ticket trends will really inform if folks maintain or lose power in state legislatures. And just to give you a few of the numbers here to give you a sense, among 50 states, 29 state legislatures are unified Republican, meaning both chambers are controlled by the Republican Party, and 19 of those state legislatures are unified control under Democrats, and only one is divided between parties. So here, Democrats really would have to make up significant ground to sort of take the lead in terms of control at the state level. Beyond the numbers and party control, I think there are just two other things to point to. One is the influence of the presidential race down ballot. So we'll be watching to see how much influence the presidential race has on these down ballot contests, as well as the candidates more specifically. And it will be especially important to see how much the presidential race mobilizes turnout of voters or not. Are voters excited about this older white male ticket, or are they not excited? And will that shape if they come out for the congressional races? And of course, the candidates of each party have to take the good and the bad of the candidates that are at the top of the ticket. And we have two men that are prone to gaffes. And so that will also affect what happens for the down ballot candidates who are going to have to answer for that. I'd add, and this is sort of the third piece, and then I'll turn it back, is that the influence of the pandemic also relates to this, because candidates are not out campaigning, canvassing door to door, doing events. It means that the presidential race gets even more air in the room, right? It controls the narrative even more for down ballot candidates. And so it's going to be particularly challenging for some of these down ballot candidates to really get their message out and not be tied so closely to the presidential race. For some, that's okay, and it'll be helpful. For others, it might be more challenging.
That is so true. I've door knocked a lot in my life, and I don't know how that's going these days. But let me go back and ask you the same question, Kelly. Since you just finished, I'm going to ask you first. So, of the three items, let's set those aside for a minute. But what keeps you up at night about the upcoming election? What's the one issue that you say is absolutely critical that we focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are broader, so I'm of course going to pun a little, give you more than one, but I think there are broader logistical issues about who can vote and how they can vote. I think we might talk a little bit more about that in the midst of the pandemic. So that sort of is what I worry about in terms of enfranchisement of voters. I think on the sort of what I'm most interested in is tied to the work that we do at the Center for American Women in Politics. So we'll be really watching some of the numbers for women, the progress we see. Do we continue to see some of the trends we saw in 2018, which was a record year for women both running for and winning office? Do we see that trend go across party lines, which it didn't in 2018? So it was entirely a trend for Democratic women. Republican women actually lost numbers and representation in 2018. So will we see that change this year? And some early numbers suggest it is changing. We're at least seeing more Republican women run for office. If they win, that'll be the next question. And then I think it also means paying attention to these gender dynamics, not only in who runs, but in how the candidates run. One thing that always bugs me is that when we don't have women on the ballot, so for example, at the top of the ticket, people stop talking about the influence of gender or how the candidates themselves perform gender and engage in gender dynamics. We know, especially with Donald Trump, that gender is a huge part of how he campaigns, how he messages, and so we should be paying attention to those dynamics, no matter if there's women or racial and ethnic minorities who are on the ballot or those candidates.
Yeah, in Canada, one of the issues with women in our institutions is that we've run more women in the last election, but in ridings that they typically are expected to lose.
Right.
So I don't know if that dynamic applies in the US as well.
It's absolutely a question in this election. So we last week broke the record for Republican women filing to run for the US House. But they are more likely to be running as challengers to incumbents, which are tough races to win because of the incumbency advantage. And they're running in crowded primary elections, which means when it comes to whether or not they're on the ballot in November, they could have already lost those races. So we can't prove that's the case yet in our race, but that's something we'll be watching for as well.
All right, well, thanks for that. Enfranchisement and how many women end up running and winning. Frank, what keeps you up at night? What's the main issue that you think we should focus on?
I'm going to take this as what am I most worried about as keeps me up at night, and that's legitimacy. We already can see arguments by Donald Trump on his magic Twitter feed trying to question the legitimacy of mail-in ballots. He has talked about voter fraud endlessly. it's hard to see a Biden victory short of a massive blowout not being called into question by Donald Trump. That said, Democrats also have their own case to make about voter suppression. We looked at the midterm elections in Georgia. It was a pretty credible case about who got to vote and who didn't based on the constituencies. Across the board, there's going to be so much more attention to the vote itself, to how we get access to the ballot. And I think with that, with all the problems with foreign influence through their trolling and hacking and so forth, legitimacy is going to be a big problem. And, when you see democracies start to fall apart, it's when the two sides cannot agree on the outcome of election. You wouldn't think this would be happening in the United States, but this historical pattern has just been rushing to the forefront. So that to me is the biggest single worry about how this thing ends in 2020.
Well, let's come back to that a little bit later, because I think we're already starting to get questions. But let's talk about let's go back to something that Kelly just mentioned about enfranchisement, because in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, and as you mentioned, Frank, the tweeting against mail-in ballots and so forth, I think that begs the question. Let's talk about how COVID will potentially affect the vote, but more on the voting process, the voter turnout, and thus the potential result. I think I heard both of you worry about these things. So what are your views on that? Let's start with Kelly.
Yeah, I think it raises all sorts of questions about whether or not the US electoral infrastructure is strong enough to handle what needs to be done in order for people to vote in a way that is safe and, as Frank mentioned, sort of legitimate, right? That doesn't raise fears about illegitimacy, and that is also fair across communities. That has always been a challenge in the US because there have been targeted efforts to make it harder for certain communities to vote. And this pandemic can both allow for greater inequality, right? Because there's justification for why we want to close down voting booths or voting centers, right? Or polling places. Or if we go to mail-in, are we making sure that we communicate how to get a mail-in ballot to everybody in multiple languages? Are we making sure people who don't have permanent addresses or who are not frequent voters are also getting these ballots or can easily get absentee ballots? And remember that we have 50 different voting systems across the country because states control this. And so what we're also going to see is likely very significant variance across the states in how they're dealing with mail-in voting, absentee voting. One more thing on this, again, that's a concern, is of course when you have the president out there saying that this is mail-in voting can cause greater fraud. We know that's not true, but we know people believe him. And we know if that's what he's putting out there, then he is not going to support the efforts that are going through Congress to try to make this a fair system across the country. And that means giving states greater money for their electoral infrastructure, which it looks like the Republicans and the president aren't willing to support. And then also making sure you put out information to encourage people to vote in that way to be safe. And so those are huge concerns. And right now, it doesn't look like we have clear solutions to them.
But Kelly, I gotta say though, I'm a little bit confused because I thought that traditionally the mail-in ballot tended to favor Republican candidates because you have service members, you have older folks, snowbirding or whatever. So why is he worried about a mail-in ballot when traditionally it's favored Republicans?
So I think there's two answers to this. One is we never really know what's in his mind, right? So some of it is a little unsure, but I do think probably what is pretty consistent and has been consistent more recently. Frank mentioned Georgia. This is the case in Georgia. You purge voter rolls, you make it harder for people to vote. It typically hurts Democratic voters to make it harder to vote. These are usually lower frequency voters. The turnout might be lower among these groups. And so if you make it easier, the concern and what has been at least the prevailing wisdom has been if you make it easier to vote, then more Democrats will vote, and therefore it'll hurt Republican candidates. There was just a recent study out by Stanford that actually said when they looked at some of the statistics on mail-in voting, because of course we have 5 states, by the way, that do fully mail-in voting. So this is not, you know, they're not dealing with significant fraud. But Stanford study showed that actually there are ways in which it can benefit Democrats, there are ways in which it can benefit Republicans, so it ended up being sort of a wash in terms of who it benefits. But I think that prevailing wisdom about increasing access helps Democrats is what the president is going off of.
Oh, okay. Frank, did you want to add something?
Just want to jump in with a couple things on this. I agree with you, JS, about the fact that mail-in voting has historically been more Republican than Democratic. One way to get a gauge of what's going to happen is to look at what's going on in the primaries since COVID. The Wisconsin primary got the most attention, and it had, I think most people were surprised by the level of turnout. The Democrats won a huge upset. They were not expected to win a statewide race for a seat in the state Supreme Court, and they were much more active in mail-in voting. Other states that haven't been quite as high profile have had lower turnout in their primaries. Georgia will be an interesting state to watch because Georgia has a very contested Senate race coming up, and there ought to be a lot of people turning up for that. One other thing about this, in some ways, you know, calling into question mail-in voting for Donald Trump hurts his own chances because it makes his own voters skeptical of the system. And there was some suspicion that that may have been what was happening in Wisconsin. On the other hand, to simply throw sand in the gears is one way to sow doubt, confusion. And if you're worried that you're never going to catch Biden in the lead, that's a strategy.
Yeah.
Oh, makes sense. So I'm going to have one more sort of general question here before we move to the audience. So speaking of disenfranchisement and mail-in ballots and whatever, let's look at demographic realities in the U.S. right now, because lower income, racialized minorities, you know, there are always efforts to make it harder for folks like that to vote. So how are the demographic issues shaping up for 2020 compared to, you know, the last couple of elections? Has the vote shifted, you know, again, from one part of the country to the other? There's more Latinos than ever before and so forth. So how is that shaping up in this election?
Do you want to go first, Frank?
Let me just jump in there and say, you know, if you want to think about big, broad trends, one sort of theory of electoral politics in the U.S. is that the so-called emerging Democratic majority, this is the title of a book that was influential in the early aughts, it argued that the demographics of the United States were going to favor Democrats. That is the increase in the non-white vote, the growth of the so-called creative class in the cities, who tend to be more liberal. Think of the tech cities, San Francisco in particular. All of that stuff was in the long term going to bring Democrats to power. And yet it hasn't happened. I think those authors thought it would happen before George W. Bush left office. On the other hand, it's not happening. Those trends continue, and the Republicans have not done much to shore up their support among non-white voters. In fact, if anything, those trends have gotten worse. George W. Bush did pick up a sizable share of the Latino vote. Donald Trump did a little bit better than Mitt Romney, but nowhere near those levels. So those things are you know, always on the table and always seem to be getting a little bit worse for the Republicans, but never quite enough to tip the full scale. Here's an interesting change. It's the elderly vote. Polling is showing Biden ahead with seniors. And that is very surprising because Trump has led with seniors. Republicans have cleaned up in the senior vote for much of the 2000s. That used to not be the case. Democrats did well based on Social Medicare issues, but seniors have been voting for Republicans. It's possible, and this shift has really shown up just sort of in the COVID crisis. It's possible that not being as concerned about the high casualty rate amongst the elderly might be hurting Republican support with those voters.
I think, and one other thing that is not directly tied to some of these demographics, but certainly related, is remembering a couple of things about what's going to be happening both at the presidential, how the presidential vote, how somebody wins, and also what's going to happen after this election when it comes to our redistricting. So I think one, in terms of, Frank mentioned earlier, the concentration of higher educated, and also diverse populations in urban centers. That's a huge issue for getting to this point where the emerging the Democratic electorate, right, actually has influence in all districts. So because there's such concentration, even though you have a growing Latino electorate, you have a shift in more educated voters voting Democrat, if they're all concentrated in areas that only give them one seat, then you don't have that spread. Of course, when it comes to our electoral college, that also helps to explain what happened last time. So Hillary Clinton can win, and Trump, she could be up 3%, and Biden can be up 5%, and still potentially lose if he's not up in the right places in order to get those electoral college votes. And then the last thing related to demographics and voting that I think is really important and really talked about in terms of this election is that whoever gets elected in this cycle, in most states, in the state legislatures, will be the ones who are drawing electoral maps for post-2020. And so there they have huge influence in how we manipulate those maps in order to either enfranchise certain groups of voters or try to diminish their influence. And obviously that's been happening forever in the United States. And so we'll be watching that as well. And I do think there'll be even higher scrutiny of those redrawn maps this time, because there have been so many Supreme Court cases, et cetera, to try to promote equality among racial groups as well as partisan, in terms of partisanship.
So that's the famous gerrymandering system, right, that people who've taken a political science class have heard about. So there you go. So whoever's elected now will redraw a map based on the 21 census for the next presidential election.
Right.
All right.
And congressional races in between.
Yes, for sure. Okay, well, that is fascinating, and the questions are pouring in. Now let's go hear from the public and what's on your mind here. So here, an interesting question on social media, because the idea here is that sometimes moments like the Dean's Scream or Binders Full of Women kind of take over a campaign and change the narrative. But of course, we've seen on the other end, President Trump saying things that most people would find outrageous, but it doesn't seem to harm him. So is social media going to be a factor in this campaign more than others, or is it going to be pretty much what we've been seeing in the last several weeks and months?
Kelly?
I mean, I think, look, social media is the way in which this president has garnered his support. So social media will continue to be highly influential. I think actually the Biden and his team are still navigating how to effectively use social media in a way that'll also mobilize his supporters. For Trump, it is not only in mobilization, but basically he gets to control the narrative. And this is part of, as if you've seen in the news, part of the concerns over the last few days even, to try to get Twitter to regulate some of the things that he's putting out that are incorrect when it comes to mail-in voting, when it comes to this scandal with Scarborough. And that's a challenge. We haven't seen Twitter. We've seen a little movement from Twitter in the last couple of days, but so it's a huge point of power and importance for President Trump. And the question will be, can the Democratic candidate use it as effectively among his supporters, I think.
I'd like to just follow on to that, and I think if you look at the campaigns, to say what Kelly pointed out, the Democrats seem to be in this, they like to wring their hands about their failures, and now their social media is just not up to snuff. And they're also, I read today like some coalition of tech companies or, billionaires are going to try to help them. And they aren't going to beat Trump at social media. They're not going to do it. Trump is, he is the master of it. He knows how to control attention in it. No one's going to beat him. Lots of people have tried. And I think, there's an asymmetry there. There are other things that you can do on social media besides drive traffic to your page, but trying to sort of, stomp out Trump's tweets is a losing strategy, as he's proven. So I think that's a place where he uniquely has the edge.
Now here's a really good question, and I deliberately did not ask it because I wanted a member of the audience to do that, and here we go. So talking about electoral strategies, one strategy is get out the vote, make sure every registered Republican votes, and, hire buses and all that. The other strategy is, appeal to the median voter and try to get the undecideds to your side and so forth. So how could the turnout be affected by the choice of the vice presidential nominee? Now, we suspect that Trump will keep his vice president, Mr. Pence, but how could Biden's VP pick maybe ignite a base or change the dynamic? We haven't talked about that, and now's the time. Who is going to be the VP pick?
I'll jump in here. I mean, because there aren't that many decisions to be made left, this one's getting a lot of attention. It may not be as consequential as we think. Biden's already signaled he's going to pick a woman, and within that, there are about 5 or 6 candidates. The question behind that, to me, is: do you pick someone who will appeal to the sort of swing voter, or someone who will mobilize the base? And if you're a swing voter theorist, maybe it's Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, who seems, especially in her primary run, took issue with Bernie Sanders, labeled herself a kind of sensible centrist who with Midwestern pragmatism. Whatever you think of that, I mean, there is a case to be made that the Democrats made a lot of ground in the 2018 elections in Republican-leaning suburbs, that they did pick up a lot of people who were occasional Democratic voters or were Republicans who were just disgusted with Trump, and perhaps a choice that reinforces that notion of the Democrats as being trustworthy, especially to suburbanites who may be offended by Donald Trump's behavior but aren't fully on board with Medicare for all and the Green New Deal, is a way to go. The other theory of the election is turn out your base. That's clearly what the Republicans are doing. You don't see Trump really trying to, reach the middle on some of his, especially with the social media stuff. There's a lot to be said for that too. Some studies show there just aren't that many swing voters left. People are so dug in, polarized on the election. It's more about getting more of your people out than getting more of their people out. Who will do that? I think if the Democrats knew what candidate would maximize their turnout, everyone would vote for them. Everyone would just say, oh, we wanted that person. And it's hard to predict who that is. And there's lots of, sort of speculation just about just got done watching The Last Dance. It's relevant here. Who is the greatest basketball player of all time? Well, who's going to be the greatest VP of all time to mobilize voters? I'm not sure there's a magic bullet out there.
Yeah, I think that the Biden camp has to be very careful. It's almost less about who they choose than who they don't choose. And so if you see them go towards a moderate, I mean, I don't think it would be smart for them to choose Klobuchar. I see the argument as Frank's laying it out, right? You can see the argument about, oh, these centrist voters, but that's what Democrats have been saying forever, and it doesn't work. So these voters are not, in many cases, at the end of the day, are not enough to shift, whereas if you can expand the electorate, because it's not just turning out your base, it's turning out people that normally don't vote, but will vote Democratic. And so I think you see in cases like Stacey Abrams, who ran for governor in Georgia and almost won, or by some arguments did win, or would have won had it not been for some of the voter suppression tactics. She was doing both. So she was able to get folks in the middle, but she also was mobilizing, registering new voters. And I think that's really what the Democrats have to look to in that sort of expanding their base and turning out their base. And that means taking seriously the very real and valid grievances of communities of color and women who have been really taken for granted by the Democratic Party forever. And it's time that there's some recognition by the Democratic Party about the reliability of those voters to electing Democrats, particularly Black women who have voted at the highest rates for Democratic candidate in 2008 and 2012. And you could argue were part of the reason because their turnout was lower, the enthusiasm was lower in 2016 than it hurt Hillary Clinton. So hopefully, I think for the Democrats, they should probably learn their lesson from the last cycle in that regard. And I think it's going to be important that if Joe Biden decides to choose a moderate white candidate, that it's going to be a problem for him.
Okay, and I'm looking at the questions so that you don't have to. And I got to say, probably at least 30% of the questions relate to the VP pick. So let's put you on the spot, Frank and Kelly. We'll start with Frank. Like, who might Joe Biden pick as his running mate?
I'm glad people want to ask about that because I went to ask Kelly about it. So, so yeah, it's an irresistible thing. I mean, I want to preface, every prediction I made in politics has mostly been wrong. But I think Val Demings is an interesting person to think about for this choice. She is the former police chief of Orlando, Florida, now serving in the House. You know, Florida is very, you know, Biden's in the lead in Florida. It's very much a state that matters. She kind of, you know, she's a cop in the, you know, in the same sort of tough prosecutor mode that Kamala Harris has tried to cultivate, but she's also been a very outspoken member of the House, has done some, you know, it's kind of raised her profile, especially in the House hearings, and noticeably really got out front in Biden's behalf after a recent gaffe he made related to race. Stacey Abrams is another person that gets talked about. I always see her name coming up and then it kind of getting blocked. I'm not, but again, this is just reading from a distance. So, you know, I think the odds against Demings are high. So that's a great pick to come in as the genius winner, and I wouldn't rule her out.
Yeah,
Kelly?
yeah. I think it's so hard to predict what's going on in the Biden camp. And I actually think that their calculation is probably changing due to the pandemic. So I was talking to a colleague earlier who works with an organization trying to empower Black women. And she was noting one of the other considerations that's even more important now is the capacity for this VP to have a strong relationship and knowledge and influence in Congress, because there's going to be so much work to address the economic crisis and the health crisis that comes from this pandemic, that the VP often does, to be that bridge between the executive and the legislative branch. And so the stakes in the sort of capital of a Val Demings or a Kamala Harris goes up, because this is now, you know, a more experienced member of the U.S. Senate. She might have more sway and friendships on Capitol Hill. It's also true that, you know, you see polls with Elizabeth Warren still being the candidate that brings the most voters. But what folks forget is that if she becomes the VP, her Senate seat becomes open, and the Republican governor of the state of Massachusetts gets to decide that seat. So at least temporarily, it could be a Republican. There are some folks saying he would choose a Democrat. I'm not sure I'm convinced of that. And so there are all these political calculations that go in. So that's clearly me punting what an answer is. But I think the good thing is, I will say this as a representative of our Center for Women in Politics, there is no shortage of qualified women. So there are plenty of women that we could be looking at for this job.
Well, I can't believe how fast these things run, but I got to get to two final questions. So I'm going to ask you to keep your answers to about 30 seconds each here. In the last election, we saw the major candidates, whether it's Trump on the Republican side, Hillary and Bernie on the Democrat side, all three of them were against free trade deals, for example, and said bad things about TPP and NAFTA. And so that affected Canada, of course. Now, in this election, we had Joe Biden say that he would rip up the presidential approval for Keystone XL. And so several of the folks listening to us want to know, you know, how does this announcement affect Canadian interests? But let's take the flip side. Is this anything that Americans would really care about? Does that swing American votes if Biden says he'd rip that permit up?
You first, Kelly.
Yeah, I have a pretty simple answer, which unfortunately for Canadians is that it's not at all on the radar of most voters. It's not, there are some voters who certainly care about this, but because of especially what's going on right now and the real sort of pro-anti-Trump takes on this moment, I don't think it's coming up in the debates.
Because I've only got 30 seconds. Keystone is Lucy with the football, and Canada is Charlie Brown. It doesn't matter what the administration is. We've had some of the most pro-oil and gas administrations in U.S. history. It hasn't gotten done. I wouldn't put the outcome of the election as the most critical thing there. Though it is the larger issue about what trade policy and what's happening to sort of globalization. That's a place where Trump clearly scored some points, and you can see the Democrats have their own wing that's against it, and I think that may be something that sticks.
Yeah.
All right, and here's the last question. We've talked about it informally together, and some of our listeners have asked that exact same question. What if we have an election that is, you know, super close, super tight, we're talking just, 1 or 2 electoral college votes either way, a hanging chad maybe. What happens if Trump loses by a smidge? Is there a spark? Is there something dangerous that could happen? You talked about legitimacy early on, Frank. So let's close with legitimacy here. How does that play out? And we'll start with Frank.
I got asked by somebody else about, will we have another civil war? I studied that period. No, but we will have a very weak federal system where you see a lot happening at the state level and a lot of resistance to whatever the winning party wants to do, and more gridlock, more deadlock, because people aren't going to accept the election's outcome. The key to this stuff getting under control are Republicans, to bring the sort of, whatever you think about Trump, delegitimizing the outcome of elections is deadly to a democracy. And the other members of that party have to say no. They've done it in a few places. When Doug Jones won in Alabama, they put a stop to some crazy conspiracy theories there. It's possible, but it's not going to be pretty.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just second Frank and say it depends on the day about how much we've seen the Republicans stand up and say, no, we're going to preserve institutions, we're going to preserve rule of law, we're going to preserve sort of what has been done in U.S. politics, and some days far less willing to do that. And it depends what they see in their advantage. I'm hopeful that they see sort of maintenance of the rule of law in this moment as hopeful, and that it helps guide voters. But I think this signals one more important thing, which is whoever wins in November, but particularly if Joe Biden does win, that it is going to be an incredibly difficult first term because he has an incredibly divided public. He's going to be facing a recession, nearing depression, health crises, and he literally will have to rebuild a government that has, in numbers and structure, fallen under this administration because of the pullback from governmental resources and investment in infrastructure and all of that. So it's surprising that anybody would apply for this job. And it's going to be hard no matter what and no matter who wins.
Incredible. So I don't disagree with that at all. Who would want that job under the current circumstances? But politicians are made of different stuff than you and I. They really aspire to that, and they want it more than anything else in the world. So someone's going to step up and someone's going to win. And let's close this portion on these thoughts here. And I want to thank you, Kelly and Frank, for sharing your perspectives on what looks like to be a really interesting U.S. election year. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us today on this inaugural Policy in a Pint that is virtual. Now, we do want to continue the conversation because, like I mentioned, this usually takes place at Junction YYC. We would end here. We would grab another beverage and then mingle on the main floor there and continue the conversation more informally. So for those of you who want to continue the conversation, let's leave this webinar. We're going to hop over to a separate Zoom meeting. You find the link and password in the confirmation email. Once you get there, you'll be in a waiting room, so please give us 2 minutes to log off this meeting, log in the other one, and then we can kind of, I think in the next meeting, we'll actually be able to see the faces of folks asking questions. And as a professor who just taught a couple classes online there, I'll tell you all about the raise hand function and whatnot in Zoom. But anyway, thank you so much for this portion of the Policy in a Pint on the US election, and we'll join you on the other side.
Thank you.
Bye. This is the very, very familiar Zoom wall that I'm used to seeing. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that this looks like it's working out. Now, I see many of you may or may not be familiar with Zoom. If you want to chat, the first thing to remember is unmute yourself. That's always a good thing. We can actually hear your question. I've been muted and now I'm unmuting myself. So it's a good thing because there's so many of us. There's a little function to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. That's a good one to learn. Raise your hand. You can see that if you click on participants and you go find yourself there, and you can raise your own hand apparently. So if that works, let's do that. And if not, let's try it old school. Get my attention by doing something like this. And then I can acknowledge you, we can unmute you, and you can ask a question to one of our experts. So we ended on a very interesting note about the legitimacy of the election, what a difficult job the next president will have. Even Donald Trump will have a tough job given everything that's happened. But who wants to share their thoughts first? Who wants to break the ice on our first Policy in a Pint networking session? Go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Joe. I'm one of the classmates of JS from last year before everything shut down in this apocalyptic fashion. Yeah, I'm just wondering about sort of approval ratings for Donald Trump, because they've like, compared to most presidents, they've remained like incredibly stable. So I'm just wondering what sort of factors led to that? Like, how is this just the normal polarization, or are there other factors involved?
I'll take a quick stab at that. I mean, Trump famously said he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't lose any votes, and people thought that was outrageous. But he's done a lot of stuff, and it's just held steady, as you said. I do think there's a long-term trend in effect. I mean, and in general, American electorates are pretty stable. I mean, we went through in the mid-20th century a period when the parties were uniquely diverse. That is, we had liberals in the Republican Party, conservatives in the southern side of the Democratic Party, and at the national level, there were people who could kind of find a little bit of what they wanted in both parties. The parties are much more ideologically aligned now. And I think that has led to a lot more stability in things like approval ratings. It's also made things much more volatile because you view the other party as the bad guys. So when they win, that's a bigger problem. When it's like, yeah, there's some of what I like in them, and there's some of what I like in these other folks. Kelly, do you want to say anything about that?
I mean, I just second that. And there's some really interesting polling from Pew Research Center about animosity towards members of the other party, that I think, while it is not directly, tied to the approval rating of this president, that approval rating is tied to loyalty, and loyalty to your candidate, to your party. And note that his approval is lower, which means that there are those folks in between that will vote for him but don't approve of him, very much at least, right? Or they weakly approve of him. But there's still that real strong partisan loyalty, which gets back to, I think, is ultimately a weakness of a two-party system, because you get people into these camps and they're willing to sacrifice on some of their beliefs in order to support their guy. And I say guy notably.
Just to follow up real quick, do you think the same sort of thing will happen with if Joe Biden wins? Like, will Joe Biden be able to go out in the street and shoot someone and people will still vote for him, or is he different from Donald Trump?
Democratic voters are less loyal. I think mean that it's been a challenge for Democrats. Some people would see it as a positive, but certainly we saw that with Hillary Clinton. We've seen it with Bernie Sanders supporters, right? A sort of unwillingness to tolerate somebody who doesn't identically support your positions. And that has been true in the Democratic Party. So I think that permission then is less true for somebody like Biden.
Yeah, just the parties, they have roughly equal vote shares, but they're not symmetrical in the way they look. Democrats are a big, broad coalition, much more fractious, much harder to get together. Probably slightly bigger in number, but different dynamics.
Yep.
So Kelly and Frank and I were chatting before the live stream, and we were talking about backgrounds. And I want to acknowledge Tim Marchand as a very smart-looking background there. Probably has a yes, absolutely. That's a fantastic, and they're all real books too, eh? Outstanding. I also want to acknowledge Maureen Hebert. I love your backdrop. Yes, Maureen is outside enjoying a beautiful day in Calgary. But just to jump on Joseph's point there, Something else that we kind of wonder is the degree of polarization in the US body politic these days. Is that just a US thing? Like, is this an outlier? Because it seems that the media just keeps harping on, you know, how bad this side is, how bad that side is, the social media is insane. Or is this just a regular business? Nothing's really changed. It's just maybe we just hear about it more these days with the proliferation of media. So what is your sense from a global comparative perspective on the degree of polarization in America?
I'll go first.
Kelly, you live there.
I mean, to me, it definitely seems like it's part of a global phenomenon. It's hard not to look at, you know, we live in a much more globally connected age. And, you know, I've been following a lot of what's happening in Brazil lately because of its COVID hotspot and sort of the unique situation there. Their president, Bolsonaro, is very much, you know, following Trump's lead. He wears a MAGA cap, you know, it probably got into, he's required actually people to use hydroxychloroquine, or has sort of made that an actual medical recommendation, probably taking his lead from Trump. These things do travel much faster now. But if we look at, you know, if we look at a lot of the, you know, the sort of Western democracies, for lack of a better term, especially the, you know, the British settler colonies, it would be Britain, Australia, Canada to a lesser extent. But you can see a lot of the same coalitions, same kinds of politics, same appeal to their Rust Belts happening. And so it's, the U.S. isn't alone, but the U.S. has some unique dynamics that I think are making this more intense.
Yeah, I think, I mean, so, you know, the U.S. is notorious for saying we're exceptional in every way. And so, of course, you know, the U.S. response is, well, yeah, no, it's different here. I think Frank's right that we're seeing similar trends everywhere. In the U.S., I think in part due to a two-party system, it seems amplified, right? It's almost easier to talk about when you have a system that's just blue and red. I mean, so Barack Obama may say there's not blue states and red states, but there are blue states and red states when it comes down to who controls power and government, and majority rule systems. And so I think that that does amplify the sense that it is somehow different, but that's certainly true in other countries as well, right? We're not the only folks, but it seems, you know, it contributes to some of the coverage of that.
Yeah, well, for what it's worth, I do agree with you. I lived in the States from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s during the start of the culture wars, Bill Clinton, the things that were said, how many people he allegedly had murdered, and in Little Rock and all this. So it was crazy. It was very, very partisan back then as well. Vern Kimball, I see you there, and I know you are a political animal, Vern. Come on, I'm going to put you on the spot there. What is it? How can we satisfy your political itch today? You and I would normally be talking on the floor of Junction YYC. You got to unmute yourself, though. Let's see.
There we go. Actually, I'm enjoying listening, so I don't really have a question. Sorry, JS. It's I must need a glass of wine or a beer, so I'm not going to ask anything today.
Well, there you go. I put an old friend on the spot, and he just lets me down. Like, you know, hey, what are you going to do? That's why we're friends.
Hello, it's Bill here.
Oh, hello, Bill.
I think for me, big issues would be relationship with China, North Korea, and Iran, and I haven't heard that mentioned. Is it liable to be more local issues rather than international issues? Thank you.
First, I commend your ability to quarantine in such a beautiful spot.
That's King Herod's palace on Masada.
Nice.
That's amazing. You know, curious to see what Kelly says about this. I think foreign policy, you know, really is not a big driver of U.S. Domestic elections. It'll come in kind of incidentally, but typically this stuff is going to be local. Although in this election, you know, there's that whole issue about foreign interference, and you know, if you take things sort of at a more structural level, there is a realignment going on where the U.S. is moving away from its traditional alliances. Those are being frayed. There's a big debate to be had about that. How much voters are going to make their minds up on it, though? I think even if they care intensely about it, they're probably going to not make that decision based on what's happening in in Iran or the Koreas.
Yeah, my guess is that the Biden camp is struggling a bit because they probably intended to talk more about foreign policy, talk about his relationships with international leaders, his experience, all of that, and really contrast it with Donald Trump, right? Which would be significant. And I think the leaders you're talking about, saying like, let's not fall into this strongman politics, let's change. I think that was in their wheelhouse. I'm not saying they still won't do that, but with the pandemic, I think there's a lot, even further of a shift, especially among voters top of mind, that will be about how are you handling my everyday? Will I have a job? Will I have health care? And that will probably push more voters. I note, by the way, that of course, international relations will also play a huge part of everybody's health and safety and economic security, but I don't know that all voters see that relationship.
Well, so I do see hands up now. So let's acknowledge Anita. Anita, unmute yourself first and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. I have an American cousin who is able to rationalize anything about Donald Trump. She's a strong Trump supporter, and she watches Fox News nonstop. That TV goes on in the morning, and it's on all day at night. So what's your comment about the influence of Fox News on keeping all the Trump supporters in line and giving them the arguments they need to live with their conscience?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want to go for it?
Go for it, Kelly. Yep.
I mean, I think there are plenty of studies that have been done looking at the influence of different media sources on political viewpoints, and you see consistently that relationship between Fox News and conservative viewpoints. So it is an echo chamber, and also pushing forth narratives that support the president. In fact, when you see on Fox News there be any challenge to the president's truth, whatever the truth is in that moment, he then goes onto social media and criticizes Fox News, which creates this whole ripple effect. So he, again, has shown his strong ability to manipulate media in a way that's advantageous to him. To be fair, I should also add that there is some of this happening on the left as well. I would argue some of the most overt political connections are not there in terms of who's controlling the narrative and what the narrative is in terms of levels of accuracy and truth. There are certainly more problems on Fox when you look at those fact checkers. But MSNBC and other sort of left-leaning media also has that challenge. And so what we're seeing, what is problematic for the polarization we were talking about in the electorate, is any voters only getting news from the side that supports their view of the world and being unwilling to acknowledge any more sort of middle-of-the-road, nonpartisan news sources.
To follow on to that, Anya, I also have a now passed away sadly, but a elderly relative who became a Fox News watcher. It completely changed him. So he became very convinced of that point of view. A couple of things. Impeachment's telling on this, comparing it with the Nixon era. Nixon was very unpopular at the end. He lost a lot of support from Republicans. It was often said by Republicans, particularly Roger Ailes, who founded Fox, who worked in the Nixon administration, that they needed their own media network. And, some commenters said what Trump had that Nixon didn't was Fox. And Fox is very good at party loyalty. That is, at reinforcing, sending out the signal, keeping people on board, getting ahead of what might be a problematic story for the party, and really kind of hammering that home. It's also interesting to see, I don't think there's any precedent for it, so many people from the network serving in the administration. That is, there's no parallel to that. So the back and forth between the two is remarkable. And to the extent that Trump is dissatisfied with him, it's not clear to me that he really has the stronger hand. So that's all I got to say on that one. I mean, my point is that Fox may be, Fox may be the most powerful player in the Republican Party, not Trump. If Fox, if the Fox commenters really went after him, it would be interesting to see what happened if, Hannity and Ingraham and the others just went all in against him.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's interesting. It would be an interesting fight for sure if Trump decided to go all out. But I see more hands up. Let's welcome Fareed. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Great, thanks.
Yeah, my question is actually going back to the strategy of the Democrats for the choice of Joe Biden. I mean, the race last time with Hillary and Bernie Sanders went on forever till the last day, and Bernie was winning like the last 10 states in a row, and she still won. There's a strategy. This time, Biden won one state, and then the number 2 and 3 dropped out, and then Bernie in 1 week dropped out. I mean, it was so fast. There was never really a fight. So what did the Democrats see to push behind Biden so hardly that everybody just dropped out of the way? And, doesn't strike me as the phenomenal, well-talked candidate that can answer Trump. So what does the Democrats see besides maybe the colored vote that might be going behind him that makes Joe Biden that exciting?
I'll give you my 2 cents on this. It was interesting to me looking at the polling all the way back to the start of the race. The top 2 leaders at the beginning were Biden and Bernie. And at the end, it was Biden and Bernie, partly because they had the most name recognition. It's, for politically engaged voters, the primaries were a roller coaster of stuff. But a lot of people sort of, I've heard of Biden. Yeah, I know that guy. That goes a long way. So I think that did matter. But more pragmatically, I think, I can't really speak to what Democrats think, but my sense is there was some greater issue about losing than about anything else. They wanted someone who they thought was a safe bet. And every candidate that came up, I've talked to friends who were Democrats, they were like, they're going to attack him on this, they're going to attack him on that. And I think especially when the people who were sort of, similar to Biden in that centrist mode, Buttigieg and others, bailed out, it did send a signal, and people coalesced around Biden who were going to be part of that vote. Elizabeth Warren had a good comment at the end of it. She had said when she dropped out that she had thought that there was a way to run that would not rehash the familiar center-left divide in the Democratic Party, and she said she was wrong. And I had actually thought that those dynamics might not be operative this time. They were, and the left side of the Democratic Party just didn't have the numbers, or there was something about the Sanders campaign that couldn't get past about 33%. And it ended quickly, and that in some ways is about Sanders not wanting to drag it out.
I also think Sanders kind of and his folks did themselves in, because they established the fear from 2016 among the rest of the Democratic electorate. So the fear was, we'll get to where we were in 2016, where we have a hugely divided electorate, and either Bernie then ends up winning, which most Democrats did not want, right? He's not a Democrat. And so, or you divide the electorate again enough that it allows Trump to win. So I think the fear that Frank mentioned was obvious throughout. I will add to that, of course, that there's this important layer of what folks believe is electable at the presidential level. So what this race reinforced, and unfortunately for those of us who are doing gender politics and race politics, what it reinforced is the dominance of whiteness and masculinity at the presidential level, and the perception that voters who are women, voters who are not white, have that the safest bet is the older white dude, because that's what we've elected forever. So numerically and on paper, it was not true that Biden was any better of a candidate. In fact, we saw so many of his potential liabilities. But it was about, what are voters comfortable with, and what do they see as the safe bet? And that led to the norm, which is having another white man win the presidency. So I think it was a huge moment. There's a moment of reflection that will have to happen in this country yet again after this election, about who we deem electable and how we make those considerations and evaluations.
Thank you.
Well, that was awesome. I have more hands up. So we'll start with Tom. I'm sorry if I don't say your last name correctly. I want to say Mully, and then Tim Marchant. So let's go with Tom first. And remember to unmute yourself.
Thanks. Is my audio okay? I've been having trouble.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. So we had a question a minute ago about foreign policy and how that might sway the vote. And I guess my question more broadly than that is, does policy really matter at all? Because Trump hasn't really pursued legislative goals since the abolition of Obamacare kind of failed. And while we saw a lot of policy debate during the Democratic primary, Biden was kind of the least active, honestly, in that area. And as Kelly is pointing out, his candidacy is largely premised on being a stable white man who's, viewed as presidential, whatever that means. So is there really a policy debate to be had? I don't see, especially if the Republicans really have policies right now.
Kelly, why don't you...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point, and I think that's right. I do think there are partisan differences in that you at least see a subset. Well, I would say on both sides of the aisle, you see a subset of voters who do really care about specific policies. So the presidential candidates have to walk the line. So on the Democratic side, there will be a lot of pressure, especially now amidst the pandemic, about Joe Biden and pushing him on Medicare for all. And that's going to be a question about which voters he can bring into the fray. And it gets to a question of turnout and mobilization on policy, I think, rather than are they going to vote Democrat or Republican, if that makes sense, right? So the policy distinctions and the policy plans help to decipher whether or not they're energized to vote at all. At this point, most voters know if they're voting one way or the other. It's just a matter of if they're enthusiastic enough to turn out at all. And so on the right, I think the issues are around economic policies. Of course, abortion is still important and will be part of this. Immigration policies and how the Donald Trump continues to talk about that. So those might motivate and energize folks on the right.
To follow on to that, I think it's a great question, Tom. I mean, if you were following the Warren campaign, boy, was it heavy on policy and some very interesting, well thought out ones. And she didn't do terribly, but it didn't win the day. One of the most interesting places to see the disconnect between policy and voting is the Republican Party. Very recently, they stood for some pretty clear things in terms of foreign and domestic policy that they've mostly abandoned. I mean, we have got the biggest deficit debt ever, and that was happening before the COVID crisis. The whole notion of Republican foreign policy under Bush and his father has been thrown out the window. Although you could argue that George W. Bush was sort of moving in that direction, and I think so much of the policy discussion from the late 20th century up into the Obama years was dominated by what, for lack of a better term, is centrism. And there really is not much of a popular base of support for that, from what I can tell from how voters react. And that I think the people who first lost their careers in this were the Jeb Bushes of this world. It's surprising that Biden actually pulled it out, given that he's associated with those things on the Democratic side.
Does that work for you, Tom?
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm going to acknowledge Tim here in a second, but I see Maureen Hebert and Lisa Young are veterans of the Policy in a Pint reality, like in person. So Maureen and Lisa, how does this compare to the real deal inside the pub? Was it okay? Maureen, please, I need you.
Sure. Actually, I think it's obviously being able to be on stage with the person who's asking the question being when we did this last time, Lisa was asking the questions and JS and I were the people answering the questions. So there's no doubt that being there in person with everybody, I think works out a bit better than this, and obviously being able to talk to everybody else in person when it's over. But I think all things considered, this is actually pretty good, and I have to say the commentary by Frank and Kelly and the questions by JS and others has been great. So I'm getting a lot out of it, and the bonus is, of course, I'm sitting outside in the backyard, so that's okay too.
Yeah, Lisa.
And, you know, I didn't have the good sense to go out to my backyard, but, you know, I am suitably equipped here.
Yes.
And, you know, it's never as good as you know, all being together in a room, but it's fantastic to actually be able to see the faces of people. I'm loving this part of this. And I want to say a special hello to one of the people who's on here, someone who's a political scientist who's joining the University of Calgary in August, I believe. Welcome to our new Vice Provost, Diversity and Inclusion, Melinda Smith, who's on the call right now.
Cheers.
Welcome.
Well, thanks. And I had to set this up because there's a couple of folks. This is our first one, as I mentioned earlier, and of course the market research folks have to ascertain whether or not you know, this is a good format. But I appreciate Maureen and Lisa chiming in and offering their thoughts before we go to Tim for probably the final question, because we had booked everyone until 15:15 and we're about a minute or two after that. But I want to acknowledge you and have the last word.
Thank you, JS. Just in the previous discussion about policy, I always remember the words of our short-lived Prime Minister, Kim Campbell, who said general elections are no time to talk about policy. But I'd like to come back to something that we discussed earlier on in the virtual beer, talking about legitimacy. And I spent a considerable amount of time in Central Europe and looking at Central European politics. And the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, is famous for saying, you only have to get elected once, and then you can be in power for as long as you like. So maybe provocatively, what will it take to have international election monitors required in the US political system? US is famous for sending ex-presidents abroad to bring legitimacy. It feels to me that we're almost getting close to when legitimacy needs to come back to the US political scene.
To me, this is, you know, it's a big pivotal moment. It could get locked up. I mean, we have a lot of examples of illiberal democracies. So Orban's Hungary, he's done even worse stuff under COVID, where elections happen, but they don't mean much. I mean, I follow Erdogan's Turkey a fair amount. You know, he's certainly tried to override losing elections time and time again. You could see it happening in the States. It's already, you know, you could argue it's already happening with voter suppression, the Georgia elections. I won't stem wind a lot. A family relative ran for office in Iowa last time, lost by 9 votes. She lost because the Republican clerk of elections would not count some of the mail-in ballots. It's a big deal. This is happening a lot. I don't think international monitors would make a huge difference, because I don't know what people would listen to there, but bringing that sense that the other side isn't going to destroy everything we believe in, and being willing to accept that is, you know, would be welcome. And nothing in this contest looks like people are geared to that.
Yeah, I don't have much to add other than to note that I think one of the differences, not that this doesn't exist elsewhere, but is monitoring at the least the strength of our domestic watchdogs. So organizations and efforts from internally that are trying to monitor and call out some of these problems, which I think we do have. And in fact, that community is increasing in size and I think robustness since over the last two elections because of these concerns. So Stacey Abrams, for example, started her own organization called Fair Vote. And there are a number of other organizations across the country, some of which are more nonpartisan and are doing this work. So I'm not sure how much that, you know, that is determinative of either preventing or pushing for greater international involvement. But I think that would be one of the responses, you know, to sort of also Frank's point that, what if, you know, do these organizations have a greater influence and can they stem some of the criticism from abroad? And then of course it falls back on US voters. So how salient is this issue of voter suppression and fraud and involvement from a foreign government? How influential is that in vote choice? And will voters select elected officials who are willing to put more sort of safety and security in the system? And this election will actually be quite telling about how much voters both pay attention to this and also push for it as an issue on somebody's platform or in their agenda.
Thanks,
Well,
JS. This works for me.
Good for you, Tim. I'm going to close it off there for the questions. When we had our pre-brief meeting last week with Kelly and Frank and discussing about the format, Kelly, we told you that U.S. elections matter a lot to us. First of all, Calgary, we have a very high proportion of dual citizens, of Americans working here in the oil patch, long history of cross-border relations going back a century and a half easily, when you Americans were trading whiskey up here in the Northwest Territories, and we had to bring the Northwest Mountain Police to get rid of those American whiskey traders. But also Justin Trudeau's father is the one who mentioned that America is important because when you guys, sneeze, we catch pneumonia.
Right.
The relationship is super important in so many ways, and American elections matter to us. They're of interest to us. And, a lot of folks do, follow this stuff very closely. And this subject, we could have gone on probably for another hour easily, but we do, all good things have to end. And so on that note, I do want to thank our participants today. I think Kelly and Frank gave us outstanding, a great show, great answers to the questions. I see some clapping there. You found you found this one here. There you go. So thank you very much.
By the way, if I can just add that I also watch Canadian elections. So it's one of my favorite things is to stream election night in Canada. So I'm just saying.
Well, I'm going to get you on Zoom.
I don't know anything, but I enjoy watching.
Well, I do want to thank our you guys were amazing. I knew we would have a good event when we had our talk last week. And also for the members of the audience, I've joked a few times that this is your test subjects here. We at the School of Public Policy, we do want to be relevant. We do want to, talk about very important public policy issues. So you will be getting a note from our events team requesting your feedback. So look for a post-event email, and we appreciate your feedback. We want to get better, and we want to respond to your needs. So once again, thanks to Frank and Kelly. That was really fun. Now, we'd love for you to connect with the School of Public Policy. We host a lot of webinars these days and release a wide variety of policy research. You can find more at www.policyschool.ca. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great evening wherever you are, and cheers for having a very successful first Policy in a Pint.
Thanks.
Goodbye now, and thanks.
Thanks so much.